The appearance of random images piled together in some weird way, shape, or form, either in street art, in religious art, out there in the world in general. We are human beings that kind of take in the world by in parts, and um, you know, it is said that humans can detect more shades of green than any other color because of our because we used to be prey and we had to figure out what was in the grass that could eat us. So we had to really pay attention to that. Um, it's somewhere along the lines where when our brains started taking in mushrooms, probably from some of our ancestors or something. We started kind of figuring things out in our world and looking for meaning in the things around us. As I went through my own recovery and I kind of looked for my own self knowledge and went into the spiritual path myself. I started learning a lot about numerology. I started learning a lot about symbolism, spirituality of all kinds, and kind of reconnecting with my Catholic, Mexican Catholic, and occult Mexican Catholic spiritual roots. That path led me to research a lot of things, and it made me find one of the most interesting accounts out there on social media, both on TikTok and Instagram, Symbolic Studies, that is curated by the brilliant Mario. Mario, welcome to the Crossroads podcast. Before we go into anything, I kind of want you to introduce yourself and kind of what you do to our audience, so we can go from there.
Right on. Sounds good. Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate the invite. Was really looking forward to this for multiple reasons, but I'm basically a lifelong artist. I started off, in my early years illustrating. I've always been a very visual person, so I've been drawn to visual art of all kinds for a very, very long time. This would lead me to go to film school, as an example. So I went to film school for a number of years, and I really got a lot out of that. But before that, I got into graphic design. And so when I was a teenager, I got into the world of design. And so I was playing around in Photoshop and Illustrator and things like that. And I was really intimately a part of the local punk, metal, hardcore scene when I was younger. And so naturally, I would lend my design skills to doing flyers and t-shirts and, things like that. And so my base for all of my sort of commercial art really is with punk rock and things of that sort. And so at some point, I found myself doing more work for bigger clients and companies and things like that. And, over time, I just became really interested in symbolism because I was always illustrating or creating something. And I didn't even realize this was a study that you can get into. And so I was at a bookstore and I came across a book on symbolism. And it kind of blew my mind that people were even writing about the symbolism of, say, the lion or the color green or whatever it might be. And that really opened me up just to even be aware that this is a study that you can pursue, right? And so since then, I just started collecting a bunch of different books on symbolism. Over time, I got to really know the lay of the land, the different authors that I thought were kind of worth, their weight in gold. And I eventually went to film school. At some point, I found the tarot. The tarot really opened me up once again to this whole new world of occultism and the mysteries, astrology, numerology, mythology, things like that. And very arrogantly, before I started studying the tarot, I thought I knew about symbolism. But it really, really put me in my place, some of the stuff I was reading. I realized that I had a lot more to learn. And so for a number of years, I was studying the tarot, and I got really interested in astrology because I figured if I'm going to be sort of a symbologist, a knowledgeable symbologist, then I need to know, the signs and what they represent and things like that. And just over time, I felt like I was learning a lot and that I was almost absorbing too much, but I wasn't putting anything out there. So I started Symbolic Studies as a way for me to put work out there. And so I've kind of merged a lot of my different, skill sets, I guess, with design and videography and things like that.
And in symbolic studies, I mean, the first thing that caught my eye out of that feed, you're basically going through each of the signs of the zodiac,
Hmm.
and speaking about the correspondence between that sign and a specific tarot card. Now, you mentioned tarot, and I'm Mexican, and we like our psychics, we like our tarot card readers and our naipe readers, and like witchcraft and all that stuff is everywhere. I grew up with this neighbor lady that used to read the tarot,
Mm.
and um, I would see in those cards this, this basic meaning when you look at it, like the tower.
Hmm.
And then, but she would make me look at deeper meaning with it,
Mm.
in each of the cards, from the stars in the background to elements that didn't make any sense when I was looking at them because of how deep this symbology and a lot of the stuff that it's trying to communicate is. Like a lady with a pitcher. What does that mean? And
Hmm.
what does that correspond to something in the sky? Uh, when you talk about tarot, and we have people from all walks of life listening to us, and they might not know about this.
Hmm.
Uh, Reading tarot cards, depending on who you ask and what you're looking at, how does that work? And why did you have to reinforce some of that knowledge base with astrology and learning about how that corresponds to cards?
Right, right. Yeah, that's a great question. The way I look at symbolism in general is that what I've come to understand now is that the reason why symbolism speaks to everybody is because for a long time it was how mystics and sages and magicians and things like that encoded a lot of information was through symbology. Well, the icons that they were creating, the artwork that they were creating, maybe even, arguably the deities that they were creating and whatnot, right? And what I've learned is that symbolism is a bridge to metaphysics, and that's actually what it's best used for. So to have a metaphysical understanding of this place, you will find a lot of those truths in symbolism if you're decoding it. I would say almost in an appropriate way, because to me there are wrong ways and right ways to decode things symbolically, and there's, I think, a right way and a wrong way to even use magic and to use divination and things like that, right? And so I'm attracted and interested in all divination systems. And so most of the time, a divination system, whether it's the tarot, the I Ching, the runes, as an example, there's a bunch of different ones out there. They are all essentially, in my opinion, they're all creating a map, a metaphysical map of different realities and of energies and signatures and kind of the human condition in a lot of ways, kind of like what we are, and so to me, I think all of those systems are interesting in how they sort of present the information and everything else. And so people have used anything and everything. You're aware of this, right? For divination purposes. So you can use dice, you can use sand or stones, you can use tea leaves, you can use bones, you can use so many different things. And so the tarot is just another aspect of that. So you don't need the cards. You don't need to have a deck around. There's a lot of simple systems out there for divination purposes. But it works, in my opinion, because I'm a firm believer in divine timing. I think things happen for a reason. Even negative things that happen in your life, hitting rock bottom, as an example. And so these things happen for a reason. And so when I'm with a client and we're going through the cards, it's amazing to me what comes through based on their situation, that I almost essentially, I'm a believer in the system itself and the process, right? And so people call them synchronicities and things like that, meaningful coincidences. And so
Yeah.
this happens in your life all the time, no matter what. How many times, at least for me, I'll be watching a movie and I'm blown away of what's kind of unfolding in the movie, because it's exactly sort of either what I'm going through or what I had been thinking about or something along these lines. So it doesn't necessarily need to be in the tarot or something like that. It's happening all around us if you pay attention.
So like a lot of these images, and again, if you're not initiated in what symbols mean, or if you have a very narrow viewpoint of the world, I remember the first time I saw the devil card
Mm,
when I was a kid. And I grew up playing Loteria, so we would see the
mm.
devil. The devil was around in a lot of ways, or in nativity scenes. In the way that the devil is depicted in Mexico is usually this red character with a little mustache and a little goatee, kind of like mine. It's not me though. And a chicken foot and a chicken foot, and one of it's a chicken foot and the other one's a goat foot, right? And I remember comparing that to the Baphomet imagery in the tarot deck that I was seeing, and it was scary and
Mm.
unknown, and I didn't know what I was looking at. And I was Catholic, and I went to Catholic school, and nuns beat my ass when I was trying to write with my left hand instead of my right hand. So I was like all sorts of messed up when I was a kid. Uh, but later on, I started learning about what that image means, and all the symbolism around it. Can you kind of like for like people that are maybe some of us have a religious bias, and we'll see Satan everywhere, but that imagery realistically doesn't have a lot to do with Satan. It's a completely different thing.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a fascinating topic. It's a huge rabbit hole. There's actually, I would say, one of the preeminent authors that has written about Baphomet at length is no longer with us, but her name is Tracy Twyman, and I had the good fortune to meet her actually a couple of times. And so she went and did a lot of research on Baphomet, and she did a lot of original research on Baphomet. And so there's so many different threads to sort of pull at with it, but Baphomet is androgynous, right? There's a dualistic aspect to Baphomet. It's two in one. It's an angel and a demon. It's masculine. It's feminine. Baphomet has one hand pointed up, one hand pointed down. There's an as above, so below sort of dynamic with that. I think that it actually does relate to a lot of Hermetic sort of principles, you can say. There's a lot of things in Hermeticism that have to do with gender and polarity, duality, the fusion of masculine and feminine, the fusion of the light and the dark, the positive and the negative, right? And to me personally, I just see this as that's part of who we are. It's been said that all of the gods and demons are within you. All of the angels and demons are within you. And I think that there's something to be said about that personally. And so you need to address sort of what's going on, the darker side of who you might be. To me, if you don't address that, that's actually when it really comes out, right? It's better to have a relationship with it instead of trying to denounce it or trying to suppress it or whatever. So to me, I want to know my masculine side. I want to know my feminine side. I want to know my positive and my negative side, right? So I think Baphomet is a symbol that represents a lot of this, but there's a whole deep history with it as well. So this is just barely scratching the surface.
So,
right?
so I'm trying to make that comparison for people that might not have that, that haven't gone down that rabbit hole.
Sure.
So comparing the Baphomet imagery that you see in the tarot deck with the this is half of it, and
Oh, there you go.
somebody gave me that weird combination of a card. You'll see that animal foot. Basically, the devil having animal features.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? Like, why does the devil have horns, and why does it have these animal features as far as feet? Like, what are we trying to say to ourselves when we draw it that way?
Yeah, in my opinion, you're really trying to bring to light its lower nature. And so there's a lower nature and higher nature, I would say, that's going on there. I would say the devil, by and large, represents the lower nature. It's actually really interesting. The most classic version of the devil card is from the Rider-Waite deck, and he's squatting. And I've done posts on symbolism related to what does squatting actually mean and represent. And it's very, very ancient. It's very, very primordial. You don't see people in the modern Western world generally squatting, but you go to other countries and you'll see people squatting in the streets and just hanging out and whatever. Obviously, there's countries that don't have Western style toilets either, and so how do you relieve yourself? You're probably squatting, right? And so everything about the devil in that card is basically bringing your eye downward. So his horns actually create a symbolic V. He's making a hand gesture. It's almost like a symbolic V. His legs are making a symbolic V. And so the glyph that associates with Earth is actually a downward arrow, a downward triangle with a line through it. So it's bringing your eye downward. And so it's bringing to light your lower nature. And to me, the idea is that, again, you want to have a relationship with this lower nature so you can ascend. So to me, the devil almost represents like the first rung of a ladder, right? That you need to step on in order to get to higher planes.
Yeah. Another image that I remember looking at, was chilling to me when I was a kid, was the death card. In a casual reading to a 13-year-old me, that card appeared, and I saw that card. I'm like, oh no, is that coming for me? Right? This image of death, uh, this horseman with a
Mm-hmm.
flag,
Yeah.
riding a horse, and you would see the ruin that he was basically walking through. Um, and I just remember the explanation that that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
Can you explain a little bit about that symbolism?
Yeah. I mean, death really is just the other side of birth or rebirth, right? And so there's so many positive aspects to death, in my opinion. There you go. Yeah.
There's a
And
Mexican version of it on
right.
Loteria.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And so to me, obviously, death comes for everyone. Our time here is limited. As an example, if you're trying to do better, if you're trying to break a bad habit, as an example, right, or break an addiction or something, symbolically, you're going to have to die. There's going to be a part of yourself that's going to have to be let go of. And so there's a huge aspect to death that's related to letting go. And I'll say too that there's a lot of mystery school systems, lodge systems, occult systems, where essentially the initiation is a symbolic death, right? So this is the case in Freemasonry. Very early on, you go through symbolic death. And so this is a really, really common sort of thing, even with like folk societies and things like that. There's different, rituals and rites that a young man has to go through and has to go out and kill an animal by themselves or something like that. Spend a night in the jungle or the desert by themselves. This to me reminds me of death, that you're basically being reborn, essentially, right? And so that's how I generally see it. Everything here, death, it's interesting when you look at the word death, eat is right there in the middle, right? And so it reminds me of just the dynamic of eating and how everything here needs to eat and feed on something. So it's just a necessary part of life, right? And so that's how I tend to see all of these different cards.
And I don't know, like my background, we used to party at cemeteries, and we used to death was really close. Like wakes
Hmm.
were in houses, and I saw a lot of dead bodies before I actually had to work and pick up some of them.
Hmm.
The what do you why do you think there's such a strange Western relationship to death versus other places? I mean, this I know it's kind of off topic, but I guess you'd be a good but viewpoint to ask this question of
Yeah.
like this fear that comes over people when they see the imagery of death. Like a skull is either, depending on who you are, because I've gotten, every now and then I post up things related to my cultural background or spiritual background, and I'm always surprised by the fear, uh, apprehension, and even sometimes revulsion towards the image of a skull or
Right.
a skeleton.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question too. Actually, I've been reading a lot lately about the differences between the traditional Eastern way of thinking about things and the traditional Western way of thinking about things. And an author I really respect, he puts it that in the Eastern world, what traditionally, and things are changing because of the internet and just like the way the modern world is, right? But traditionally, the Eastern world could be defined with contemplation, and the Western world can be defined by action. And this drives like the society, right? And so contemplation versus action. People here in the West, generally are more inclined just to do something, and they think that by just doing something they're accomplishing something, or it's more fulfilling to them or whatever. So there's less of an emphasis on contemplation and really thinking about something and whatnot. In the Eastern world, people, that's where you're going to get a lot of sort of meditative masters and mystics and things like that. And so they're more inclined to really contemplate and think about something before taking action. Right. And so I think that plays a big part in it, because all you have to do is really just like think about it, and you'll come across, in my opinion, the value of death and sort of why it's something that's worth understanding instead of trying to denounce and be afraid of or whatever. And so this is partly why I was attracted to occultism too, and esoteric studies and whatnot, is because they were actually talking about these things. And I've always found it to be very fascinating. So in a lot of ways, I'm kind of like, I don't know, part of me is kind of like an anthropologist in a way. Like I like to just understand different cultures and how they view things and everything else. And I don't get triggered by this information. So to me, it's always made sense to want to know more.
Where, like, when and where was your moment where you're studying this, and then news article, something where you see something that you recognize immediately that people kind of missed, like symbolically wise? Where was that eureka moment for you where you're like, oh, like I'm reading through the Matrix aspect of this? Like, I guess is what I'm asking.
That's a cool question. The first thing that comes to mind, I think that there's probably been multiple moments, but one of the things that really sticks out as you bring this up is I went to a metal show with a friend, and this was after I was studying all of this stuff and really getting into it. And we were at the show, and the shirts, the band shirts, and it's metal music, right? And so there's a lot of like occult imagery and esoteric stuff going on. And I'm just looking at some of these shirts, and I'm like, wow, I'm like, these are like, some of these shirts are like really potent, like, and what they're encoding into the artwork is really interesting. And so metal album covers and things like that, for a long time, I've seen things that I think the average listener probably doesn't see, but someone in the band is probably really into this stuff. But my friend bought a t-shirt, and he bought a t-shirt for a band, and he showed it to me. And I'm telling him all the symbolism on it. I'm like, oh, this means this and that means that. And, I was kind of just educating him with what I was learning. And he kind of just looked at me dumbfounded. And he's the one that bought it, and he's the one who's going to wear it and be walking around and advertising it and things like that. And so that's when I knew in part that I'm like, I'm on a different path. It's not for everybody. But once you start seeing the world through a symbolic lens, it's really amazing, all of the different things that kind of come to light, whether it's in the news or in advertising or whatever,
And where have you seen it that you've like been surprised to see it? Every now and then we see these viral Instagram carousels or TikTok carousels where you see Hollywood with occult symbolism. Beyonce is doing, this sign, or whoever's
Right.
doing that sign. Have you seen any of that, or like a surprising one? I would guess.
Oh, absolutely. I'll say, one of the surprising ones personally is when the George Floyd situation happened. I saw the symbolism of what was going on, and there was so much Gemini symbolism encoded into that storyline. I was completely blown away. And it happened during Gemini season. And I could go through a laundry list of the things that were kind of going on with that. But because I study the signs during the time of the sign itself,
Yeah.
I'm tuned into that sign. And on occasion, a major storyline comes through that completely overlays with that sign or overlays with something else that I've looked into or whatnot. But I've seen it in events kind of like that in the news. And then the question becomes...
What about the George Floyd incident? Can you explain the
Yeah, sure.
the Gemini relationship to that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the first things I noticed was that there was an NBA player who was coming around, and his name is Steven Jackson, if I'm not mistaken. And he was saying that George Floyd was like his twin. and he mentioned this multiple times in the news.
Okay.
And he said that he's his
I
twin.
remember. I remember. I
Yeah, he
remember.
said
I
he's like my
remember.
brother and this and that. He said it multiple times, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And I'm like, well, with Gemini symbolism and twin symbolism, these twins oftentimes are called hero twins. And so there's usually one positive twin and then one negative twin. And I'm like, well, in this instance, Steven Jackson would be the light twin because he's successful and an NBA player. And George Floyd, just based on his lifestyle and everything else, he would sort of be the dark twin. So that was just one thing that I kind of just put on my mental shelf. I thought it was interesting. And then I noticed that it was basically, I believe it's St. Paul, Minnesota, or it's
Yeah.
another city, but they're known as Twin Cities.
The Twin
And
Cities.
so,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
they're known as Twin Cities. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting too. The city that George Floyd was in or is from originally, that's going on. And then I would say that one of the big kickers for me, and you might have to just hang on for a brief second while I explain this because it's deep esoteric symbolism. But in Babylon, basically the time of Gemini was referred to as the brick mold. And the reason why this is the case is because this is when they would start baking bricks underneath the sun and they would resume building projects. And so I had already known that. And you actually see this encoded in the sun card in the tarot. Oftentimes, what you'll see in the sun card are two children and they're holding hands in front of a brick wall, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so this is actually the story of Rome, the founding of Rome as well. So the hero twins of Rome, Romulus and Remus, they're said to be born from a cosmic egg. They actually built the first brick wall in Rome. And so they are the founders of Rome in many ways. This is where we get Rome from. We get Rome from Remus, basically, or Romulus, excuse me. And so the evil twin, Romulus, actually kills Remus at this exact same wall. And so there's a whole entire brick connection baked in. It's very esoteric. A lot of people don't come across this unless they're really into this kind of information. And the kicker to me was all of these riots started happening in protest of what was going on with George Floyd and the whole entire situation. And you started seeing pallets of bricks show up mysteriously all over the country, right?
Yeah, I actually got to see one of those pallets being dropped off in Portland at day 101 of the protest there. Yeah, that's wild. I
So
never
this is
thought
just
about it.
scratching the surface. This is just me from memory, but there's even more stuff than that because even George Floyd, his father, is a Freemason. And his father's a Freemason, and there's a lot of Gemini twin symbolism within Freemasonry. And what is Masonry about? Bricks. They call
Bricks.
each other brothers. One of the main things with Freemasonry are those twin pillars. You're going to see them in all Freemasonic lodges, right? It looks just like the Gemini twins, pretty much, right? And so there's just a lot sort of going on there. The other thing I'll say too is at one point I saw George Floyd and he had he was wearing a hat, and on the bottom of the bill, it was written Brick Boys. And so he was part of a crew called the Brick Boys, which obviously drug connotations and stuff like that obviously overlap with this. And then apparently the housing project that he grew up at was called the Bricks as well. And so it just like really stacked on top of each other so much that I'm like, okay, this is either orchestrated and a facilitated sort of event or situation.
Or a giant alignment of some sort.
Exactly. Yeah.
And for people that want to send us some tinfoil hats over, or something like that. I get that. I understand that aspect of it.
Uh-huh.
But I've also I've also noticed alignment and a lot of things basically kind of rhyming or repeating themselves and in symbolism and in things that now I imagine in the past, somebody would see an eagle eating a snake on top of a cactus and he would spread the word about it. Now we have social media. Now we have everybody's a camera. Everybody's capturing what's going on in an age. Now, this is a deeper question. What do you think is going on there? What, like, as somebody that studies this, and I'm somebody that's seen it, or at least kind of figured out that there's some edges to this strange coincidence probability bending thing that happens
Mhm.
where symbolism, some of our historical past and the way that the ways that we've interpreted these symbols in the past and collectively just identify something as meaning something.
Mhm.
What do you think is going on there? Like, why do you think that there are times where we see things like a man with a bleeding ear standing behind a podium, raising his fist, or like George Floyd and then this brick connection? Like, what do you think is going on there? Some people would say a lot of this is orchestrated and it's a psyops. And I've worked for the government before, and I can tell you that they're not that efficient. There's no way they could all get their shit together to do something like that. What do you think is happening?
Right. Some people refer to this as synchro mysticism. And so basically that, just like what you're saying, there's these huge alignments, there's smaller alignments and whatever, and everything can kind of just hit at just the right time to really encode something like really massive for people who are paying attention to it. And so to me, it almost reminds me of like gears within gears within gears or something along these lines, almost like the Mayan calendars, kind of like that, where you have these different wheels within wheels. And if they're all spinning at the same time, on occasion, they're all going to hit the bottom portion of each other at the exact same time, or they're all going to be aligned at the same time. And you're going to have this sort of mega sort of event.
Like right now,
Um,
the planets are kind of like all. Most of them are pretty. I mean, visually, you can see a lot of those stars together, right? And we're living through a lot of crazy, crazy,
oh, yeah.
surreal things right now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Um, Before we move on, I want to ask you this. Last year, during the beginning part of this year, we saw Cat Williams, the comedian, show up on a very viral podcast, uh, and basically ushered in this age of revelation. Almost like a lot of stuff that was hidden came out. Um, is it something that you've kind of seen that it ushers in an age or that is bringing forth something? Like, have you seen a relationship between some of these alignments and then what happens after?
Right, right. I feel like we're always constantly going through a concealing, revealing cycle. And so what conceals reveals. And I've gotten into a lot of the symbolism related to that as it relates to like the veil and veil symbolism and what conceals reveals. And so I see a lot of things right now taking place where it's revealing a lot of things, the veil's being lifted in so many different ways. And I think as an example with the craziness of 2020 and what was going on there with everything, a lot of people's hands were basically revealed to us. I saw this with people that I know personally. I almost kind of felt like everyone was exposed. Like their mentality was exposed. They were forced to actually talk about how they see the world and how they perceive things and whatever, because there's so many different opinions about what was going on and everything. And so, what I've heard from astrologers and things like that is that it does seem as though there is a major revealing, and what's being revealed to can be off putting. It can be really weird. It can be uncomfortable and whatnot. And so, I see that that's kind of what we're going through right now is a series of these revelations, if you will. But there's always things that are hidden. That's kind of the nature of this reality, too.
A weird thing that somebody told me is the hand that steals will always hide itself, but the one that spends reveals the other one's intention,
Hmm.
right? So,
Yeah, yeah,
one hand's revealing, one hand's,
yeah, yeah.
hiding. I could see like the cycle of it. If you There are a lot of skeptics out there that'll see astrology and will watch a few YouTube videos on how to debunk it and all that. Um, what do you say to people of that nature that are pretty skeptical about the influence of the stars and astrology in our lives? And like there's a lot of arguments against it, is what I would say.
Sure.
But I've met people on both sides of that argument, and people have shared things related to what is happening in the sky and that have been pretty profound to me. So, like, what is your opinion on this?
Yeah, in my opinion, the real gems of astrology, and I have the same opinion with the tarot. The real gems with astrology and the real gems with the tarot aren't necessarily with these alignments or what might be happening in the stars. I think that's incredibly interesting and important. But if people watch my channel, what they'll notice is that I'm actually talking more about what could be called like the archetypal nature of the signs. I'm talking more about the mythology of the signs, the symbolism associated with the signs. And I think that astrology is one of these systems where you can literally study it and you are learning about aspects of yourself, right? And that's what I kind of champion more than anything else personally. I'm interested in the process of individuation and kind of getting to the heart of the matter and getting to your center, your sort of sacred center or your inner sanctum, right? And so I've done a lot of work with that in presentations and whatnot. And so I think the real value with astrology isn't paying attention to the signs. It's not your horoscope. It's literally the sort of book that it represents with each sign, because each sign is a deep, deep well that has historical angles associated with it, psychological angles, spiritual angles associated with it. And so I'm not that kind of astrologer. I'm not so much paying attention to every single movement in the heavens. I like to stargaze. I like to know what's going on and stuff like that. But that's more so for other types of astrologers. I'm bringing more of like, what are the stories of these signs? Like, what can they say about humanity? What can they say about yourself? What things do they encode? And so same thing with the tarot. Even though I do readings, I love to do readings. I get a lot out of it. My clients and things like that get a lot out of it too. But I think the real value with the tarot is almost studying it like a book and understanding the symbolism associated with the cards and things like that. So that tends to be how I approach it personally.
For everyday people moving around in this world, I'm a new American. I've been in this country for almost 6 years now, and I'm curious. I'm fascinated about everything. I always tell this story. I had this giant medical class in Tennessee, and one of the local sheriffs was a fan, and he came over and talked to me, and he was like, "Hey, what do you want to see? Like, what do you want to get? Like, you want to go to a moonshine still that we have here? You want to take you over here?" It's like, I want to go see people dancing with snakes. Like, I know you have that here.
Yeah,
And he
right.
was like, "What do you want to see that?" It was like, I'm Mexican, and that to me is exotic. I
Hmm.
mean, if I'm coming, this to me is an exotic thing in my eyes, and also just the symbolism of people proving their faith dancing with this poisonous serpent. I grew up around them, and I used to make money off hunting them and selling the skins to bootmakers.
Hmm.
Um, those were real snakes, and I just remember this feeling of being in like, this is like the occult America that a lot of
Hmm.
people look at or try to find, I guess. It's there. It's not in the open like in Mexico. You see that stuff out in the open. Um, the Going to Washington and seeing the way that the buildings are built, seeing Freemasonry symbology everywhere, kind of, or Roman symbology or Egyptian
Yeah.
symbology, kind of imbued in everything from the money
Hmm.
to the buildings to the government. Um, I have a friend that says that Egypt turned into Rome, and that Rome turned into something into the church, and the church basically kind of like made its way to a lot of parts. Like, what do you think is going on there as far as the symbology and why the U.S. has adopted the seemingly random imagery for itself? The pyramid, the eye, these messianic symbols. What do you think is going on there? And should we worried about lizards controlling us, or some sort of weird Egyptian cult? What's going on? People have all these theories. Like, what's your opinion on this as an expert?
Yeah. I mean, this is a broader way of answering that question that we can get specifically into some of these things. Like, I'm really interested in the obelisk. I'm really interested in pyramid symbolism, the eye of providence or the
Let,
all-seeing
let,
eye.
let's 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 start with the obelisk, which is I mean, we see them in a lot of European cities. Obviously, something coming out of the ancient Egyptian culture.
Hmm.
Like, why do we have? Why is the Washington Monument this giant obelisk? Like, why is that the Washington Monument?
Well, this happens to be one of my favorite topics to talk about, actually.
There you go.
It gets to the heart of a lot of my research over the last handful of years and some of my conclusions about the foundation of symbolism, basically, right? Um, so, my personal opinion is that there was actually a tradition that preceded all modern current traditions, and it's gone by different names. And so, in my opinion, it seems as though humanity has lived through at least three major symbolic ages. This is different from the great ages that people talk about with the signs, and it's even different from the ages like the Kali Yuga and things like that. These are three symbolic ages, and the authors that I really respect and pay a lot of attention to talk about it like this as well. I would say that we currently live in a very solarized world. This is basically why the sun is so important to a lot of people and a lot of cultures and things like that. And no doubt the sun is incredibly important.
Uh,
What you'll find,
yeah, I mean, one of the first thing that comes to mind is the Father and the Son.
yeah,
The Jesus symbology and the Son symbology behind it, I guess.
yep, yeah, exactly right. Yep. So the church, a lot of people associate solar symbolism with Christ and everything else, and you can make that case absolutely, like all day long. I think his story is deeper than that, whether you consider him to have been a real person or a myth or whatever. But we currently live in a very solarized world. So astrology, we're talking about the signs and things like that. It's a solar-based system because what you're paying attention to is actually the path of the sun. All of these signs are along the line of the ecliptic, which is the path of the sun. And so, more modern authors will talk about how everything is solar based. What it took me years to come across this information, but we have gone through a major shift, humanity has. And this early tradition that preceded all other traditions can be referred to as a polar tradition. It could also be referred to as the primordial tradition. Funny enough, sometimes it's even referred to as the northern tradition or the mystic pole tradition. And so there's been a great symbolic shift from what I refer to as polar symbolism to solar symbolism. And there are deities that were associated with this idea that there is a sort of point of pivot that everything in the heavens revolve around. And everything on Earth revolves around. And so sometimes this is referred to as the world axis. If you notice, there's one central star in the heavens that all of the stars revolve around. So this can also be referred to as like the stellar tradition as well. So before people were focused on the sun, in the earliest age, they were focused on the stars. And all of the stars in the sky, except for the wandering stars, the planets, they all go around one central star. This star is called the pole star, or the North Star, or Polaris. And the
Polaris,
reason
yeah.
why, yeah, the reason why it's associated with a pole is because it's an axis or it's an axle that things revolve around. So there's a relationship with the North Star and the North Pole, and this world axis is a point of pivot. This whole basic idea was of like primary concern to ancient peoples. And so the obelisk is a symbolic axle, basically. It's a symbolic pole. So whether you're talking about the obelisk, you're talking about the tower, even the building itself, you're talking about sort of like ancient kind of phallic symbolism, basically. So you'll notice that actually a lot of cultures have this idea of going to a pilgrimage location and going around this central totem. And these are called circumambulation rituals. The most well-known version of this is like in Mecca, right? And so for Muslims, the Kaaba cube is the point of pivot. Symbolically, it's their spiritual pole, basically. And so a lot of times the pilgrimage location represents where heaven and earth meet each other. And usually something very mystical happened there at some point in time. So their ritual is that, or their pilgrimage is that they go to Mecca and then they go around the Kaaba cube 7 times. They're actually going counterclockwise around the Kaaba cube. And so when they're going around it, the Kaaba is on their left-hand side. This is known as being a polar rotation. Going counterclockwise is polar, going clockwise is more solar, and that's actually more expansive. And so they're actually mirroring the fixed stars going around Polaris, basically, because this is really the most ancient sky clock. The most ancient sky clock is following the dippers of all constellations going around the pole star. Today, in the modern world, the sky clock that most people acknowledge is the path of the sun. And you can say that there was perhaps an intermediary symbolic age of lunar symbolism and using the moon as a sky clock. So I see this as there's been three major sky clocks. Today it's the sun. Before that, it seems as though you can make the case that the moon was maybe this transitional phase. But before that, it was actually the fixed stars. People were paying attention to the fixed stars more
It
than
would
anything.
seem that it would seem I don't know, from my perspective, it would seem like keeping track of time with a pole star would make time expansive. Like I mean, if you're keeping track of the stars, that's a I mean, these are eons that we're going to be talking about, I guess.
Yeah,
Um,
it was a different time. People had a different way of living. People had a different understanding of things. Everything was way more local. People weren't so concerned, in my opinion, from what I've learned, with what was happening around the world. Everything polar actually has to do with the center. And so people had their different locations that they considered to be their sacred center, right? The thing that they would die for, basically. And so there's a book that I've read. It's called At the Center of the World by this guy named John Michel. And he really gets into all of this stuff, basically. He shows different tribes that had these different sort of totems, these central totems. My understanding is kings way back in the day, they wanted to rule from the center of their region or from the center of their empire. And so knowing the center of your location was really important. And so it's called centrography. And so they wanted to put a central totem in the middle of whatever their landscape sort of looks like. And they wanted to rule from that location. And this is where people would congregate. And this is where a lot of important things would happen at. I would say a pyramid is a really great symbolic interface that kind of matches this because really a pyramid is a symbolic mountain, pretty much. And mountain symbolism relates to obelisk symbolism in that it's viewed as heaven meeting earth. That's what the obelisk basically represents. It's like a bridge to the heavens, right? That's what the world tree represents as well. But climbing a mountain, scaling a mountain represents the same thing. And it's oftentimes been viewed as like a place of transformation and as a way you can connect with the gods and things
yeah.
like that. So,
I managed to climb the Sun Pyramid in Teotihuacan. Like I went there in one of the last years that you could actually do that. I think it's closed down. They don't allow anybody to go up there.
mm-hmm,
And and I remember going up there and enjoying the view. It's a brilliant place.
mm-hmm.
A man came up to me and told me like, "Whoa, this isn't the Sun Pyramid. This was built way before the Aztecs. Nobody knows what this actually means, and these probably people are fooling themselves trying to worship the sun up here. This is not about the sun," he would say.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
uh, the 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 whole aspect of having this four-sided pyramid, and like he kept pointing at the mountains around us because there's a bunch of there's a mountain range around it, and how they kind of emulate that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Um, for me, when I go to places like that, and I always every time I travel, I try and go somewhere unique, and I really gravitate towards some of these archaeological and even mortuary monuments and stuff like that. When you when you look at our money and the symbolism that is imbued in our money, and or just government in general, um, you are somebody that studies symbolism. When you talk about the power of symbolism, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that the image of a pyramid and an eye over it is going to affect all of us in the same way because we associate it to some sort of subconscious thing? Or does the image itself have some sort of weird power it's casting out to us? Like, what is going on there with that communication?
Yeah, I think that we have what you can refer to as maybe ancestral memory, something along these lines. And so when you see something that looks dangerous, you kind of inherently know, right? And so conversely, when you see something that is appealing and it might speak to your soul in a way, even though it's the first time you've ever laid eyes on whatever it might be. And so the way I see it is that the powers that be or shouldn't be, whatever you want to call them, and sort of the monetary system and the artwork on currency and things like that, it's all done for alchemical purposes. And I would say that there's actually an alchemical process with creating money. Actually, to circle completely back around, it's really interesting. My understanding of like the modern banking system goes back to the Knights Templars, and they basically, from what I've gathered from different authors, is that they received the alchemical formula to make money through their correspondence with Baphomet. And that Baphomet actually gave them the insights on how to create a banking system and essentially create fractional reserve banking, which basically allows you to generate more wealth. That's kind of the whole entire idea. This is kind of the alchemical process, turning lead into gold.
Yeah.
And so they set up these banks.
Really?
They set up these banks along the pilgrimage path to the Holy Land for Europeans. So people who were going to the Middle East to pay homage, to their faith, there was a lot of robbers and pirates and things like that along the way. And so you didn't want to bring all of your silver with you. And so these Templars, they built up these primitive banks basically, and you can deposit your silver and they'll give you basically this sheet of esoteric information and they can decode it and they'll know how much money you have in the bank. And then you can take money out along the way. And so if you were approached by a pirate or something like that, you're not going to lose all your money. But apparently the secret of where they got this whole entire formula from to create almost infinite wealth is from Baphomet. And there's a whole entire history with them and Baphomet and worshiping Baphomet and whatnot.
Which is we arrived at that Friday the 13th when they got
yeah.
Which pretty symbolic number afterwards. Maybe
right.
It's an interesting connection, and again, people might send us these tinfoil hats and everything, but it's an interesting one. The when we talk about the association, or you mention, we see you'll put a rubber snake on the ground, and even kids that have never seen a snake before, they'll jump. Yeah. Something I may or may not have done with my kid at some point, and she freaked
right.
out when she saw the snake, and I'm like, "You never seen a snake before that I'm aware of." Genetic memory is I think it's a thing. We definitely have some sort of software in us that I'm not too sure that anybody's kind of mapped out. But then like I don't know, like one example that I can have is, it's almost a universal thing where these horned beings represent nefarious spirits or things outside of this realm that wish us ill. I mean, you see these in Hindu art, you see these in Japanese yokai spirits and stuff like that. You even see this in like Mesoamerican artwork and paintings when you see some of these more, for lack of a better word, some of these demonic representations of these lower beings basically here to kind of torment and harass us. Now, where do you think how is that possible? I mean, this weird transmission that we all seem to have. I mean, I read Carl Jung, and the collective subconscious is something that I'm really kind of like really deeply studying right now. What is your theory on this as somebody that studied this subject matter closely?
Right. Well, I mean, from a broad lens, and horn symbolism to me is super fascinating and interesting. It generally means like power of some sort, right? A lot of times mystical power, is something that it's oftentimes associated with. I'm I also, obviously I think of horned animals, so I think of the bull or the cow. I think of the goat as an example, right? And so horn symbolism is definitely a deep weave. But what I'll say regarding sort of ancestral memory or whatnot is I'm personally not a materialist, and so I see it that the material world, from a symbology perspective and from a spiritual perspective, that it's the realm of symbolism, it's the realm of ideas and concepts, it's the spirit realm or the dream realm that preceded the material realm, in my opinion. And I think you can actually make a really good case for that. So a lot of people like to think that the material realm existed first, and then associations and meaning and things like that came after the fact. I see that as a complete inversion personally. So I see it that the thought of a flame, as an example, I have a candle burning right here. Fire existed as an idea before fire even physically existed. So I'll, by extension, Ed existed before the thought or idea of Ed existed prior to physically Ed being a person, right? So this is how I tend to see everything. And so everything, the realm of meaning preceded the physical realm, right? So that's just one thing to kind of put out there. So I think that changes the game. That changes the game with basically everything. And so thought forms and whatnot, this came prior.
Yeah, this
So this is the original genesis of things.
this the story in one movie that I saw, John dies at the end, I think it's called. I don't remember exactly the name of it. The story in that movie, and something that's happened to me a few times, where I'm dreaming of driving down this roadway and I crash into a tree in the dream.
Mm.
And then I wake up and lightning just struck outside. Now,
Whoa.
was I in the car predicting the fact that the lightning was gonna go outside, and so I had to like justify it in my dream, or how does that work? Is that kind of like a manifestation of what you're talking about? How, you know, maybe we have this backwards. Maybe thought is first, and then
Yeah.
the outside world would be second. We
Yeah.
have this.
Yeah. That's how I personally see it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Because when you're talking about pure, what people will refer to as pure metaphysic or metaphysics, you're dealing with pure intellect, and so it's pure mind. It's non-physical. It precedes the physical reality that we live within. So just to explain my perspective more, I see it that we live in sort of you can refer to it, and I don't mean this in any negative sort of way by any means. I'm happy to be alive. I'm glad to be here. I see a lot of benefits of being around right now in this specific timeline. So I'm incredibly grateful. But you can make the case that this is a descended realm. And so this is a descended, dense realm. And what happens here is actually sort of an echo or reflection of what's actually happening on higher realms. And that's how it actually works, is that the higher realms dictate what happens down below, not the other way around. That's my sort of personal framework for how I see things these days. And so it's not unlike a pyramid or something like that. It's not unlike any kind of structure where the command comes from on high. It comes from a higher realm, basically. So the higher realm dictates what happens in a lower realm. So that's why I think that, like, personally, what I see in the world, I see that there's like a spiritual war basically going on, even in individuals, right? Spiritual warfare within oneself, pretty much, right? This is symbolic of a higher reality, in my opinion, that we live in a lower reality. That's not to demean it in any way, but that I just see that that's probably how it is.
yeah. As somebody that has experience, you talk about lower realities. I went through 12 years of the bloodiest drug war that I think has ever manifested itself in our reality. This
Right.
and experiencing that, and then closing my eyes and opening them, and being somewhere in South Dakota, in this generally rural place and just peaceful, and people are nice and welcoming. And these two realities that are
Mhm.
existing at the same place and at the same time in a lot of ways. This reflection of what you say, what's going on at a higher plane.
Mhm.
You know, I don't know. For me, and this is just my belief. Like what you put out there is what you get back, I guess, in a lot of ways, and depending on what the majority is kind of casting out is what we have manifested around us in a lot of ways. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Oh, I mean, that's absolutely a huge aspect of it for sure. I talk to people all the time, through my tarot sessions and things like that about perspective and how much your perspective and your individual history, your individual psychology, your spiritual framework, your attitude, it really is going to be one of those things where you're going to get back what you do put out there, and people expect that too in a weird way. It's like a subconscious sort of thing. And so, as an example, someone that's always screwing people over, they're paranoid. They're paranoid because they think that that's going to happen to them. I always think about The Sopranos, and Tony having these panic attacks. Have you seen it by chance?
Yeah.
He has these panic attacks and he's going to see this therapist and everything. And it's because, I mean, he's done so much dirty stuff in his life. That's the kind of work he's in, right? That he has to be aware of his surroundings. And at any point, someone that he screwed over 7, 10 years ago can come back and do him in. And so it's one of these things where, yeah, absolutely. Like what you put out there, you're going to get back. In a lot of ways, everything is kind of like a reflecting pool here. Everything is kind of like a mirroring sort of dynamic, in a lot of ways. So I see that's absolutely true for sure.
When we go into the realm of symbology and like as an everyday type of thing,
Mhm.
like what do you tell people as far as like where to start like with this realm? I mean, I remember watching one of your videos and you had some book recommendations, and I immediately nerded out and got some of them and
Oh,
started kind
nice.
of reading about them. And I'm somebody that I do training for the government when it comes to situational awareness overseas and threat detection and figuring out who might be a risk factor and who might not be, and just kind of utilizing some very primitive tools that I developed over years of working in weird environments, and just telling like, you know what, hyper aware people in any environment are either there to keep people safe or to predate on somebody. So whenever
Mm-hmm.
somebody's looking around in any environment and who isn't focused on the purpose of an event, that's somebody that I look closely at. And that's just one level of my observational parameters. But
Yeah.
now I'm like, but he's wearing an ISIS. He's wearing an ISIS symbolism on him, or he's wearing
Mm.
a Catholic regalia, or this tattoo that he has on him looks like the medal of Saint Benedict.
Mm.
What do you think, other than kind of understanding the deeper meanings of people around us? Like, what other benefits do you think the symbolism has, and where do people start to learn about this?
Yeah. I'll address where to start first. So I think that basically you can just start paying attention. Paying attention. You don't have to go get a book. If you are like that and you like to read, that's certainly how I get a lot of my information. And that's something that I'll just say too real quick, is that a lot of people have told me like, hey, you're putting out stuff that's different than what I've heard other astrologers or tarot people talk about, and they want to know like how or where I'm getting it from. It's because of all my books. So when I'm starting a new weave and I'm trying to understand, say, the symbolism of the wheel, I'm not going online. I'm not Googling it or anything really. I'm spending time in my library And right now, I can look through 30 different books on wheel symbolism. And between all of these different resources, I can actually get a really good picture very quickly on like what the gist is with it, right? And I also have like good authors around and things like that. So that's if you really want to nerd out and you're inclined to do that, feel free and check out my channel. And I do have book recommendations or reach out or something like that. But I think literally just being aware, like what you were talking about, being aware, paying attention. And it's amazing, in my opinion, how much people actually inherently, innately understand about some of this stuff. Because I do sessions with people, I've talked to people who have never ever purchased a tarot deck, never really looked or studied one. And some of their insights about some of the cards, man, are really, really interesting. I'm like, whoa, that's spot on. So I'm more of a person where I think that I don't like to basically be a gatekeeper with things. And I think that real spirituality, if you kind of look at it that way, it's accessible to all people, and so it's one of these things where if you pay attention to the signs and symbols around you, you will start picking up patterns. Like as humans, like in many ways, we are built to recognize patterns. Pattern recognition is part of the thing. Someone's IQ, I've never taken an IQ test, but my understanding is it's all about pattern recognition. They're giving you different types of patterns and they're seeing how good you are at acknowledging those patterns and if you can decode it and whatnot. So paying attention to the signs and symbols around you when you're reading, or when you're watching a movie, like talking about the movie, what does it represent? What does it mean? Having a dialogue with people, paying attention to your dreams, noticing what's in commercials, what's the messaging of different ads and whatnot. Like, I think you can really go a long way just by doing that, or even if you are someone who is Catholic or whatever, like some of the artwork in some of these churches, completely mind-blowing. There's so much to take away from it. So I think it's kind of just a shift in perception, in many ways, that can get the ball rolling to maybe at some point you might be interested. This is another thing I recommend to people. Just start with something. Start with, if there's a myth or a deity or a symbol that you become interested in, follow that weave. That's what I've done. And so it's just now over time, I've followed many dozens and dozens of different weaves, dozens and dozens of different symbols. And so I have that sort of under my belt now. So I'm very much heart-based when it comes to that. Like I follow what's interesting to me. And so I think that that's a good sort of thing for people to recognize. Just follow what's of interest to you.
We're currently living through our second presidential term of this character. This I don't know. Like I think if there's going to be any myths written about current living characters, I think somebody like him that somehow beat all the odds, won the presidency, then lost it, then came back, and then the attempted assassination, his absurdly tall son, all of it is interesting. Politics aside, all of that aside, what do you think about the symbolism of the Orange Man? Our current president Donald Trump. There's a lot going on there. I would think.
Oh yeah, man, that's a completely loaded one, and I see it very much the same way. I consider him to be a character on the world stage, essentially, but his branding and his symbolism is so potent. It's so strong. It's really, really intriguing. So whether you like him or hate him, he like probably has your interest to some degree, right? And I think that in many ways probably designed to be polarizing, to all sort of parties or whatever. And so you're either fanatically for or like against him. The first thing that comes to mind personally that I think is fascinating is the fact that he symbolically represents like an emperor. He symbolically represents an emperor. He symbolically represents like a king or a lord. To be a president means to like preside over something. And I think of like an emperor or king sitting on their throne. Again, kind of going back to a little bit of what we were talking about earlier, ruling from this sort of central location. This is a whole entire deep weave that we can get into, but
his America First thing, his isolationist, build a wall.
Yeah.
Uh, I think most of us, when we see him on the news, he's always in a seated position,
Yeah.
signing,
That's right.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, the throne in and of itself is something that I've done a bit of research on, and like what it actually sort of represents and everything. So basically, a good lord or king or emperor in the ancient world brought stability. They bring structure. They actually operate as a symbolic pole, a spiritual pole that people can revolve around, that people can actually pivot around, that people can actually look towards for orientation. That's actually an aspect to some of what I was talking about earlier with this mystic pole or world axis. Sometimes it's referred to as the axis mundi. And so the reason why, as well, old emperors and lords and kings wanted to rule from the center is because oftentimes old empires were divided into quarters from a center. So it's almost like this cross that expands from a central location. So then you have the northern section, southern section, eastern section, western section. And so if the king rules from the center, they actually are in the middle of the four quadrants. And old kings believed that they were, my understanding, that they were unifiers, that they unified the kingdom, but this is really important, that they unified heaven and earth as well. That's an old thing. China was once called, or sometimes called, the Middle Empire for this reason, ruling from the central location. And this is a whole entire study. But they believe that they unified the quarters of their land. They also believe that they unified heaven and earth together. So there's a divine sort of aspect there, right? Sometimes this relationship is called the Great Triad, that there's a relationship between heaven, earth, and man. And actually, I believe that that's true, and that we all represent this connection between heaven and earth, symbolically, basically. But it's traditional to show, in the tarot at least, the emperor wearing red, wearing orange. It's very, very warm. And so this card corresponds with Aries. And so Aries is the first sign of the zodiac. It's a fire sign, a cardinal fire sign. And there's a lot of symbolism related to Aries that has to do with sacrifice. And so, as an example, Christ was crucified during Aries season, right? Julius Caesar was assassinated during Aries season. There's multiple myths that encode this whole entire dynamic. In fact, Aries season and March relates to Mars. That's where we get March from. The MAR from March is related to Mars. What do soldiers do? They march, right? And so it's been known that a lot of great wars have actually started in Aries season and in March, actually. And so there's a whole warring dynamic there. But Mars is the red planet. Mars rules Aries. And so when I think of the Orange Man, I can't not think about all of this symbolism here, right? What are the odds that he's the orange guy, and that there's all of this red, fiery sort of symbolism related to these kings and lords and whatnot? Because, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's the bleeding ear, the bleeding ear during, when we look back at that time, he wasn't doing that well, and then he got a grazing shot in the ear, and all of a sudden we saw red. And like, if I ask a lot of people about that day and what they remember about it, they remember a bleeding ear, the red bleeding ear.
Yeah, exactly right. So here's another sort of layer to all this. The zodiac, the signs of the zodiac correspond with the human body. Aries is symbolic of the head, right? And so there are many old myths and storylines about beheading a king and also killing the king. And some people even refer to it as the killing of the king ritual, basically. And that if a king isn't pulling their own weight, then they might be subject to being killed and sometimes beheaded. And there's even like European festivals and stuff like that where they would have a mock beheading of the king, basically, right? And so I just think it's all very interesting. It's a whole entire soup between Ares and Mars, head symbolism, March, assassinations, all this kind of stuff. So I think Trump really also, we call the tarot cards Trump cards, the major arcana, the Trump cards,
Yeah.
right? So there's that whole entire weave too. The one thing I'll say too, just to kind of like wrap this up, is that the Emperor card is the fourth card of the major arcana, and this goes back to the quartering of the land because you're talking about quarters. This goes back to why Jesus was crucified on a cross during Aries season. And so the cross really relates to king symbolism in a lot of ways. And even the king of planets, Jupiter, the symbol for Jupiter looks like the number 4. So there's a whole entire aspect to the number 4 that relates to some of what we're talking about here.
That's amazing. And also, like, again, like another facet of why, it's interesting to pay attention to this underlying conversation that seems to be happening between the reality and ourselves when a lot of these things start showing up, aligning and rhyming as far as symbolism, what our ancestors thought things meant, and what we value. You mentioned the Christ symbolism, and the U.S. The U.S. has I grew up Catholic, which apparently isn't Christian enough for the U.S., which is it's always fascinated me. When I went to that church where they were dancing with poisonous snakes, I was told that I wasn't that I was asked if I was Christian. I said, yeah, I'm Catholic, and they said, no, so you're not Christian, which is pretty interesting. Then you meet Mormons, and they have their own vision of it's almost like they have, like, I remember this episode from American Gods when they go and visit Easter, Stara, and there all of these Jesuses there. There's black Jesus, there's white Jesus, there's a bunch of different hippie Jesus, Mexican Jesus, all the Jesuses. With your kind of knowledge base and observation base, what does specific American Jesus symbology have you seen, or cultural Jesus symbology have you seen that is like American specific? Like what is different between this American concept of Jesus and the other Jesuses that other people in other cultures are kind of like centered on?
That's a really, really interesting question. Because to be honest with you, I've been thinking about this almost exact topic recently. And what I see is that American Jesus is more like a friend, more like buddy Jesus almost, in a way, or something like that. There's definitely more of a new age sort of spin, I would say, with Jesus. He's more of that hippie sort of Jesus. He's less dogmatic. He's more flexible. Because we're talking about Protestantism, basically, right?
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
So I've actually been, one of my sort of personal studies lately has been looking at the difference between Protestantism in the West, Catholicism, and sort of the Vatican establishment with that, and then also how that relates to Orthodoxy, specifically like Russian Orthodoxy. And it's really interesting just to see the differences between everything. So I see it that American Protestantism really is way more relaxed with everything, because there is no central sort of hierarchy with that. People can create churches and do kind of whatever they want to do. And there's really like no checks and balances with that. My understanding is you're not really getting that in Catholicism, and you're definitely not getting that in Orthodoxy, right?
No, I guess for me, my Jesus is a constant reminder of the suffering and the sacrifice.
There you
right?
go. Exactly.
He is a king, but he's a king with a very heavy crown.
Yes.
He is penance is very much at the root of the faith. My whole family came from a very very penitent type, whipping themselves type background. So and recreating crucifixions.
Right.
And so that's the Jesus that I grew up with. And then all of a sudden I go to the US and Jesus is all about prosperity and like, hey, get after that cash. And, and he's a hippie, he's always showing up and like giving you a hand while you're doing your work or something like karate tournament. Jesus is there, kind of like doing you a favor. This
Yeah.
this all, but there's a weird difference I mean, it's almost alien to me to kind of see that relationship.
Yeah.
Um, and when I see the image of a prosperity preacher, this he's wearing the suit, he's wearing the watch. There's the music. He's on a stage. It's just completely different than what I grew up with, which is the priest, and the different type of Catholic kind of symbolism.
Yeah. Oh yeah, dude. Exactly right. So it's interesting to me that you bring this up because again, I've been thinking about it lately and whatnot. And my grandma used to go to a Catholic Spanish mass church. And I went multiple times and the vibe is like distinctly different. And then my parents for a while were kind of shopping around and going to different churches, but they basically got away from Catholicism and they thought Protestantism was sort of the way. And those churches is like, just look at what modern mega churches are like. I don't know if you've ever seen footage of that, but it's basically
I've been in some of the biggest ones. And
really,
just again, I'm new here. I want to experience. That's exotic to me. Like people go
yeah.
to Italy and go to 16 Chapel. I'll go to a mega church in Texas. Why? Because it's Cirque du Soleil.
Exactly. That's awesome, dude. I want to go. I want to go to some of these big ones in the Bible Belt and stuff like that. But so you totally get it. It's like it's a whole entire extravagant sort of thing. It's a whole entire production. They have a whole entire production team with video and audio and the band, and there's people flying through the air, and it's just getting more and more and more extreme. And what I'll say is that this highlights once again kind of what we were talking about earlier with action being a Western thing and Americans really kind of like leading the way with that it's all about the spectacle, right? And so penance, that's like a foreign concept to a lot of these churches and whatever.
Yeah, like
so it's all about
the first thing that struck me is that nobody was getting on their knees really. And if you're in Catholic mass, you stand up, you sit down, you're on your knees, and then you stand up again, and you're like, there's a lot of that, and then you're quiet,
Yeah.
contemplation and prayer.
Mm-hmm.
But here it's like testimony. What's going on? Like, what are you doing? How much are you giving? Like running around, dancing, moving around, but getting into convulsions, speaking in tongues. You have to be demonstrating that something is happening, and the only way they know how to do it is to emote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. It's what's gonna keep people's attention more is if you have this big extravagant sort of production and whatever. So unfortunately, I just think that in many ways they're getting away from like these principles that really matter and some of these lessons that really matter that I think you can get away or you can get from, the Christian sort of way of looking at things. So unfortunately, I don't have too many positive things to say about these types of churches. And so it's just one of those things where I get why Americans are attracted to it and why normal people are sort of gravitating to these sorts of things or whatever.
Yeah.
But it doesn't hold my attention, and I look at it and I'm like, wow, this feels like a fall from grace for me personally.
Yeah, I've evolved in my spirituality. I grew up Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
I had a massive fight with the church that kind of led me to like seek out my own personal kind of spiritual practice. But I still appreciate it though. Like I read the Bible and Jesus and the what I read and grew up with is still very much a part of my life. And Jesus was anti-state. He was an anarchist in a lot of ways, and I like that about him. He rolled around with a bunch of gangsters. One of them carried a sword, which is something I really appreciate. There's a bunch of powerful revolutionary things he said, and I just focus on that for myself. Like it's always been pretty surprising how many Christians I've met that have been pretty unkind to me, that have been very unchrist-like.
Oh yeah.
And
right.
which kind of leads me to the kind of the final part of this conversation, and hopefully one of many that we can have in the future, because I'm a giant fan. I nerd out on this type of stuff, and I've been going through this process of kind of rediscovery and a little bit of anthropological kind of digging and kind of figuring things out. I grew up in a very very a, a strange and mixed spiritual background of both Catholicism and what it the times that I was growing up. This is during the 80s and the 90s, was a very hidden faith. The cult of Santa Muerte, or basically the veneration of a death deity. We would as a family, we would keep it hidden from others. And it's something that commonly it's a common story that I've heard over and over again across all of Mexico. I've traveled around kind of studying this. They would hide their veneration of this skeletal figure behind a Virgin Mary, and different symbolisms would be incorporated into it. And as far as I could find out, I think it's been probably active since probably 300 years at least in Mexico. People have been trying to figure out where it came from. I traced it back to a church in La Noria in Zacatecas, where it was being venerated within a church with full authorization by the church in the form of this small effigy of death. And over the years, it has evolved into many different things, but one of the oldest contemporary images of it is this one, this is actually part of my weird collection of pre-2000s Santa Muerte iconography and art, which is actually very rare to find. Most of the stuff you'll see out there is after the 2000s. And what we see is a robed figure, a skeleton with a halo, a scale, and a world globe in one of its hands, which is a common representation that you see early on of her.
Yeah.
And also, death is a her in Mexico. The male Grim Reaper turns into a female in Mexico. I reached out way back asking questions around this, and I just wanted to see what your opinion on is, just symbolically of this deity.
Yeah, no, it's a deep weave and rabbit hole, for sure, because I find it to be really, really intriguing and interesting. And what I would say is that there are a number of deities that I would classify as being dark mother deities, and related to this primordial feminine sort of archetypal energy. And there you go. Yeah. Oftentimes they're related to the stars. They're related to, all of that. So there you go right there. And, one of the most intriguing things that I maybe want to relay from my personal perspective on things, and I don't want to disrespect anybody if they have a different way of interpreting things or whatnot, but a lot of dark mother goddesses have an association with Ursa Major, in the northern sky, which relates back to this primitive sky clock. And there's a few things that I'll just relay to you, that Ursa Major, the Big Dipper, kind of looks like a scythe. And there's symbolism that says that its two scythes actually going around the pole star, the North Star. The Virgin Mary was once referred to as Stella Maris, which means the star of the sea. And that the star of the sea, in my opinion, it can be none other than the North Star, that the North Star is the main star for sea navigation and things like that. And so the kicker to me that I think is so interesting is the scales. I did one in-person presentation in Texas to a group of people a few months ago. And then I did a presentation online called The Axis of Libra. And I really get into the scales of Libra and how it relates to the dark feminine, to the dark mother. And I think it's fascinating to me that Ursa Major and Minor, the Big Dipper and Little Dipper, in China, in ancient China, they actually referred to them as, at one point in time, as the jade scales. And they saw that these two constellations, instead of being dippers and vessels, they were actually the pans of a big cosmic scale, basically. And this same world axis, this same pole, was actually basically the pedestal or the handle for the scales itself. And so there's a deep, deep feminine weave with scale symbolism. And so I see it that potentially there is northern constellation symbolism baked right in there. But I personally have an appreciation for Dark Mother symbolism. I think it's really interesting. The church is very much against this in so many different ways. You see it sprinkled here and there with some stuff related to the Virgin Mary, in my opinion. In the occult world, the Dark Mother sometimes is referred to as Typhon. This is different from Greek Typhon. So this is the Typhonian tradition is the stellar tradition, basically. And when I refer to this primordial tradition, it's very, very, very feminine in nature. I'll also say, too, that this early tradition, people have said from my research, that this early tradition was when the last golden age had occurred. And a lot of people say that the last golden age was actually ruled by Saturn. And so typically Saturn has a scythe. In my opinion, I see it that Saturn maybe had a fall from grace symbolically and is now viewed as an old man with a white beard, the scythe, and the hourglass. But at one point in time, it seems as though Saturn was actually viewed as being very, very feminine, perhaps even a crone. We get Chronos from Saturn, chronology, father time, it may have been actually mother time. And so I see this as a potential sort of connection to other Dark Mother, Primordial Mother archetypes, of which there's many. But again, a lot of them relate to Ursa Major. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there as a potential thing.
She is depicted with tools a lot of times. And when I was active, I met this lady who seemed to have this knowledge base around it that was pretty old. She would talk about a scythe being one of her tools, which kind of goes back into the Saturnian thing. The nicho where she used to keep her little bone Santa Muerte had a cube icon on the front of it, which was pretty interesting. Saturnian thing, but it had the depiction of a carved cube in profile in front of it, which I always thought was interesting. An hourglass, an owl, a ladder, a skull, an hourglass, a ladder, a skull, a scythe, scales. On one end, it had a little devil, and another end, it had a coin, a gold coin. Just small elements like this, which I think are, there's a lot of people that want to make the connection between pre-Hispanic or Mesoamerican type spiritual practices and this. I personally, I've dug deep into this, and I could see it in maybe some of the depictions of the Virgin Mary, the Virgin of Guadalupe, as she's called in Mexico, and how she is represented. The story goes that it's like a miracle that she appeared in this shroud. I don't buy that. She used to be depicted with a crown, and now she's not. But there's a lot of symbolism in her. She has a sash across her stomach, so she doesn't have a child with her. She's pregnant, and with the Holy Death now, we see a lot of representations of her being pregnant instead of having a child in her arms. So there's depictions of death pregnant, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
I've tried to piece it together myself, and again, a big part of why I went into symbology and is kind of researching some of this stuff myself, because it's a lot. There's a lot there, and it's kind of all mixed together. As far as the tools go, you see a scythe, you see an hourglass, you see an owl. Like, what does the owl represent to you? I've heard wisdom. I've heard the element of the night, and that the owl represents this energy of the night, and she is basically. Some of the mystics that I've talked to about death, some of the people that have worked and practiced this for a long time, view her as the darkness behind the stars. It's something I keep hearing in different mystical circles around La Santa Muerte. What do you think?
I love that. That's really interesting. But yeah, the owl. No, the
Yeah.
owl is a fascinating creature. It's kind of cool that you're bringing it up too, because we've had owls around us lately, and so I hear them hooting at night and communicating with each other. So they've kind of been on my mind. So the nocturnal aspect definitely comes to mind, right? A lot of this symbolism to me is like what precedes the light. It's the darkness. It's the expanse of space or whatever you might want to say. And so good things come from the dark. There's so much symbolism that basically suggests that light comes from darkness, basically, right? And so I think that this kind of plays into that generally. But the owl, yeah, you hit upon a lot of the major aspects with the owl. I've also heard too that there's an aspect too where they swoop down to get their prey, and so they're kind of coming from a higher plane, and they're the mouse or whatever never saw it coming at all, right?
That's
But
true.
I'll say too, the other thing to me that's really interesting, people have had owl sightings, and this is more of a mystical supernatural thing. People have had owl sightings in some very odd kind of ways, and that they show up in really strange sort of ways. And so much so that people have connected supernatural, mystical, otherworldly kind of like energy with the owl as well, for sure. I have a guy online that I'm friends with, and he's a big owl nerd, and he ran through all of these different stories with me. People even have connected them with like extraterrestrials and things like that. And so there's definitely like a spiritual dynamic to them. Even when you look at owls, dude, I mean, I've seen some owl photos where it looks like you're looking at a very wise, ancient, sage like person. It's like some of their eyes are penetrating my soul, even through the screen,
Yeah.
So that has blown me away too, of just how they look and their presence and demeanor and
Yeah.
everything else.
One of the most fascinating owl videos I've ever seen is a nighttime video feed of an eagle nest. It's this eagle nest, and there's some baby eagles inside of it, pretty grown, almost about to fly, but it's nighttime, and this owl from the pitch blackness just swoops in and snatches one of them out of the nest, and this giant eagle there is completely helpless
Mm-hmm.
because it's not in its element. And if you want to talk about a clear representation of death in a symbolic way, I mean, this owl is it in this moment.
Absolutely. Another thing I'll add with the owl is that, the feminine versus the masculine. Masculine symbolism is generally more phallic. It's more exposed. It's kind of like the rays of the sun where it penetrates and it's more expansive, basically. Feminine symbolism is more receptive. You're going inward, right? And so I just think it's interesting that even with like something like a bowl, right? Like a bowl is receptive, the cup is receptive. It relates to water and things like that. And so there's more of a feminine sort of connotation with the bowl. And then you have owl right there in bowl. You have a bee, and then you have owl. So there's sort of this receptive feminine sort of thing that I kind of pick up from it a little bit too.
Yeah.
And kind of just reminds me too of just like the power of the feminine and how primordial it really is. And so I put a lot of stock into that personally. It's something that I'm very interested in.
One interesting part of the faith, and again, these things I've been piecing together over years of travel and going and talking to people. The aspect of death in Mexico and the way she's venerated, she gets spoken of in as a girl, as a lady, and as an old woman, all in
Ooh.
this, all in the same time. Like you will hear somebody invoke her and ask La Niña Blanca, the white girl, and then they'll switch to Reina Hermosa, like a beautiful queen, and at the end, like Madre or mother or grandmother.
Mm.
You'll hear this variation of ages. She's all ages basically.
Yeah, I love that. That's so fascinating. So there's a triune nature to her, right?
Yeah, which
Yeah.
which
That
which
makes a lot of
which I've
sense.
heard other, like a Hecate type
Yes,
deity having it.
exactly. Yeah.
So I've been trying to figure out if it's another aspect of maybe Dark Mother, or some of the aspects of it. I mean, you'll see multi-faced goddesses depicted in Hindu culture. So I'm trying to figure out if that's what we're seeing here, because we don't have well, there's some representations of death that have multiple faces. You'll see a half woman face and a half skull face in some iconography, but when you go to a shrine, there's always multiple representations.
Sure.
Like it's like a key factor of an altar to her. That's like she's multiple forms of her.
Yeah, that to me is super interesting. I mean, the goddess has many expressions, and the god has many expressions too. So personally, I think it's interesting that she holds the scales. One of the depictions that I've seen is that she's not holding like the handle of the scales, like she's actually holding the scales, like she is the middle handle sort of thing, right? So she is the axis, she's the fulcrum, she's the point of pivot basically, right? And so what I've put together just with scale symbolism is that the pans of the scales represent duality. And so you oftentimes in some symbolic artwork you might see like a sun and a moon in the scales or something like that, right? Or I've seen like black stones or black pebbles and white petals, right? Something along these lines. But the scales can't function without that central point of pivot, without that central fulcrum. And so Lady Justice, as an example, she holds scales in one hand and then she holds a sword in the other hand. So oftentimes, or like in the tarot, the Justice card, she's sitting between two pillars because she's neutral. She is in between the two pillars. One pillar is masculine, the other one's feminine. One might be solar, the other might be lunar. So she's the middle path. She's the middle way. She's unbiased. She basically represents sort of the synthesis of these two things. And from what I've gathered, the fact that she's holding the scales, this means that she precedes duality, that she actually comes before that. And so she sort of represents like the original central pillar in a way, the middle path sort of thing. So she's not, either which way. And so the fact that she's doing that and holding the scales that way, that's kind of how I see it. Again, I did a whole presentation called the Libra axis, or the axis of Libra. And I get into this way more, but that's a very, very powerful thing that she's holding the scales like that.
And the final one, and it's
Sure.
just something, again, this is just a curiosity to have you here, and it's pretty cool to have this conversation about some of these things.
Yeah.
For everybody to kind of listen to and hear. The way that she is presented in some traditions, including the one that I grew up in, she has three phases or three essences. Or colors, you could call them as well. A true believer will have a stolen statue, a gifted statue, and an earned statue, or something that they buy at the end of it. But the first one is stolen. The second one is gifted. The second one is a gift, and the last one is earned or bought. Right. This three phases. And the way she manifests in people, and this is more of a mystical thing that I've talked to many people, and I went through some of this myself. She presents to you for the first time in black, then in red, and then in white. You hear different interpretations of this. What do you think about those colors and what they represent, and how you go? How this process might, what does this mean in your
right.
eyes?
Wow. That's a really good one. I love that. I've never heard of the stolen, given, earned sort of dynamic. That is really interesting. I'll be chewing on that actually, because that's fascinating. Black, red, and white. It kind of just reminds me of duality. So with duality, you could almost look at it like a symbolic pole, almost like a magnet. There's a positive end, there's a negative end, there's a black end, there's a white end potentially, right? And then so red obviously kind of symbolically represents something in the middle. Rightly put, you said earlier, it's like we associate and we see more greens than anything else, right? For very good reason. So I see red as being that intermediary color. But red is primal too. So red is super primal. When it comes to the chakra system, our lowest chakra is red. And so even when you're looking at like the color band, right, you have red generally down below, and then even beneath that you have infrared, and then at the top you have violet, and then you have ultraviolet above that, right? So it's the lowest sort of color, but it's a color that I think represents like humanity in a lot of different ways, to be honest. Like the color of blood, it's a very passionate color, things like that. So that kind of is what comes to mind sort of immediately, is just that whole entire dynamic. So this is all new information, but I'll be definitely
Yeah.
thinking about this because it's
Yeah.
pretty
I
cool.
remember reading, seeing in one of your videos the black being the color of initiation, and basically
Yes. There
the
you go.
nature of it. Uh, it's it's a very powerful color. So for the fact that it's the first color, or
Right.
the first form, is
Yep.
interesting as being source related.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That's how I see it too. Exactly.
And finally, the white one, which is different interpretations, purity,
Hmm.
um, uh, the end of a cycle, death. The whole you at the end of a manda, or basically a process. People go through these multiple deaths in life, in some of these traditions. So they go from black to red to white multiple times in their lives. So you'll see their
Oh,
altars
interesting.
alternating as far as the color that's on there. But it's
Right.
traditional to give her white flowers at the end of a cycle, which
Right.
is it's always been like, I don't know. It's like there's a lot going on there. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so I'll share this, and it's just something to chew on, but I see it that, the Dark Mother is so significant and important, and this is just the interface I'm using for some of the symbolism. But when a woman wears white on her wedding day, first off, there's a lot of Virgo symbolism that corresponds with bridal symbolism. Like it's just like a complete sync, Virgo and the bride, basically. And so she's almost the symbolic bride of the zodiac, in my opinion. But I've made the case that when a woman wears white on her wedding day and she's unveiled and everything else, right? Veil symbolism corresponds with Virgo as well, that it's almost a presentation. It's almost like wrapping, like a present or something like that. But it's basically there is more than meets the eye. She is also an expression of the Dark Mother. And so this white veneer is kind of a veil for what she actually truly represents, because there is a deep mystery to her. There's a depth to her, all of these different types of things. And so the white is almost just kind of like this like front facing sort of thing. But in actuality, when you really get to the depths of what a woman represents, what she's capable of, all these different types of things, I think you can kind of make the case that there is a dark mother, primordial feminine sort of archetypal thing sort of going on there. But the white, again, is just kind of like the dressing, essentially.
Yeah, again, fascinating for me. Just Mexican Catholicism. I think the only form of native spiritual practices that practice or elements of native spiritual practice that are still present in Mexico is through the fact that we have at our center as Catholics a brown virgin. If you think about it, like
Mm,
at the center of most churches in Mexico and most Catholic spiritual practice, there's a brown virgin in the middle of it, a dark mother representation. And I
yeah.
think there's something about that has produced some of these new variations of spirituality, and some of the things that now turn into a skeleton with a dress that is
Right.
populating. I mean, we just came back from a trip from Vegas, and there's a sanctuary in Vegas,
Hmm.
of her, and it's fascinating how it's growing and kind of moving around, and the symbolism that it's carrying with it, and how people that have never been exposed to anything even close to it will walk into a room like that and recognize immediately what they're looking at,
Wow.
and the power of it. Um,
Right. Right.
Mario, this has been a fascinating conversation. I've nerded out a lot.
Right.
It's getting up there in time. I want to invite you back, specifically to talk about. I have a few historical events that happened recently and the symbolism around them, and I kind of want to talk to you about some of these things. It's to me, it's amazing and fascinating to have somebody of your category to bounce things off of. We could have political analysts here. We can have security analysts here, but like somebody that is giving us hints and bits of the matrix just through symbology is pretty fascinating. I mean, some of the stuff you dropped about Trump is pretty interesting. It just adds another layer to our comprehension of what's going on around us. So thank you again very much for joining us.
Oh yeah, you got it. No, thanks for the invite, and I'm happy to do it anytime. I thought this was fascinating as well. I learned a lot, and it was great to finally connect and all of that. And so we'll make it happen again.
Again, thank you for joining us.
Yep.